Policy Institute to all of you who are tuning into this webinar from around the world. I'm in Australia at the moment. Our guest is in Delhi, at least I assume our guest is in Delhi, and I will come to him in a minute. But we are seeking, as the Asia Society Policy Institute, to gather views from the countries across Asia about how the COVID crisis is affecting them, how they're looking to the upcoming US presidential elections, and on top of that, how they're viewing the rolling dynamic of the US-China relationship together with other challenges they face. Today, I'm honoured to welcome back to the Asia Society stage Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, and I regard the Minister for External Affairs of India as a friend and colleague. I've known him for quite some time. A colleague in the sense that, a little like myself, he has a career as a professional diplomat in the Indian Foreign Service before he went into Indian political life relatively recently. In my own personal diplomatic career, I never reached Jaishankar's great and illustrious heights. But I then did slide down the food chain of life into Australian politics. And I'll talk to my friend Jaishankar about how he's finding political life fairly soon. Also, the thing to say about our guest today at the Asia Society, quite apart from being a professional Indian diplomat with vast experience in the international domain, he served as Indian ambassador in Washington and in Beijing. He has had a large range of additional postings, including Moscow and Tokyo, and therefore is a person deeply familiar with the world. He's also decided to become an author, something I always encourage, and recently, very recently, has released a book entitled The India Way, Strategies for an Uncertain World. And we'll talk a little bit about his book during the course of this program as well. Minister Jaishankar, Jai, welcome to the Asia Society. It's wonderful to have you back.
Thank you. Thank you. And had life been normal, we would have done this a month ago in New York, which was what we did last year. I think I missed a lot of things in that normalcy, but this is among them. So I hope when we talk about the issues of the day, let's briefly pretend we are still on the sidelines of the UNGA, bring in the UN a little bit and the state of the world, how it looks from New York as well, even though neither of us are sitting there. And it's really wonderful to be back and great to have an opportunity to chat with you.
Thank you very much. I see some posters behind you, my friend, which advertise your book, The India Way. I assume it's on sale in America as well as around the world. Is it just on sale in India?
Yes, this was a delicate hint that I had actually written a book. It's doing decently. Most of the early sales were, of course, in India for logistical reasons, apart from everything else. And in a way, I would say I wrote the book very honestly with primarily with an Indian audience in mind. I felt that it was important for them to be aware of some of the very, very sweeping changes which were taking place in the world. When you are a large country, sometimes a somewhat self-absorbed society, I think you tend to assume that the world is more static and predictable than it is. So the reason why I finally put it together, because there were a collection of talks which I had given, but I then sat and rewrote the whole thing, was to start a debate or at least a thinking process in India exactly on the issues that you spoke about. Where's the US, what's happening with China, what is global rebalancing about, where is globalization heading. These are many of the issues, and of course it's written from an Indian perspective, but as I sort of say in the book, I have no objections if the world eavesdrops on this conversation.
Well, One of the core arguments of your book seems to be that we have reached almost peak globalization and perhaps moved past it. We're now witnessing a new phase of anti-globalization and rising nationalism. And in fact, you go on to virtually argue that there are virtues which we need to recognize and accept as far as nationalism is concerned. So for the benefit of our audience, perhaps you could just spend a few minutes, Minister, explaining to me your core argument in terms of where the world now stands in, let's call it the globalization trend or counter trend, and where therefore countries like India fit into this new dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Well, the orthodox argument, Kevin, has been that there's globalization and there's nationalism, and that's kind of black and white. Now, what I have tried to suggest in my book is it isn't that black and white. I mean, first of all, we are talking of a particular model or a particular experience of globalization. And at the later parts of my book, I suggest that maybe we have not properly defined globalization. There could be many kinds of globalization. We can talk about that. But the issue is that if you take the orthodox globalization, which is very trade-centered, which is very finance-centered, to a great extent, the interpenetration of economies and societies, mobility is another feature of it. It hasn't worked for everybody. It hasn't worked for everybody because the way it was envisaged and engineered, there were inherent biases, positive and negative. There were inherent interests in it. As a result, what has happened is 20 years after globalization came into vogue, there are a set of societies which say, well, I'm not so sure this was good for me. Within societies, there are debates. There are, in a sense, class wars which have been aggravated by globalization. And those have turned, in many cases, into political outcomes. I mean, we saw that in the United States in 2016. In a sense, we saw that in the UK. I mean, if you are picking on Mexicans and Polish plumbers and refugees from North Africa, there's a sort of I would say a societal feeling which has been mobilized using an external argument or an external catalyst, and this has created turmoil. Now, the answer, in my view, which I haven't developed fully in the book, it's sort of latent out there, is maybe we need to think about globalization very differently, and maybe in some parts accept that globalization is not always the answer, because if countries and people fear that they are losing their identity, that their interests are getting run over by the biggest bus which is driving down the globalization road, I think they're going to stand up and fight. And that's exactly what we are seeing. So, when it comes to nationalism, I would suggest, like there are multiple kinds of globalization, there are also multiple kinds of nationalism. There are parts of the world where, very frankly, being nationalistic is a good word. I mean, if you go to a country which lost its independence, which fought a century to regain it, I mean, the first thing you say, I'm a nationalist. And everybody knows exactly what you're saying. Now, that may not work in another geography where when you say that, their history, it connotes something very, very different. So I caution people on both accounts. Don't go for a simplistic view of globalization. Don't go for a simplistic view of nationalism. There's much more nuance out there. And whatever else you can say about the world is not flat.
It's interesting what you say about globalization. My own argument has always been that there are at least two forms of it. One is unsustainable. It's what I call neoliberal globalization, which is simply about the complete access for markets in trade and capital and people around the world, almost suspending politics as if it doesn't exist. And then there's something which I've called, and the term is not generally accepted, but social democratic globalization, which understands the great disruptions which occur within societies by opening markets. And if you're going to sustain the upside and the benefits from globalization, then you must harness the wealth, partly redistribute it, but also reinvest in those communities and parts of those countries which find themselves economically and negatively impacted. So you're right, I think, to distinguish sort of different tenets within the debate. Your nuanced explanation of nationalism I also find interesting. Would you describe your own government, the Modi government, as a nationalist government? Would you see Xi Jinping's government in China as a nationalist government? To what extent is the term useful? Over to you, my friend.
Yes. I mean, yes to our government, and yes, I think to President Xi's China as well. Though, having said a yes, they're very different yeses. And the reason is this, because partly China's history is China's history. So, you know, you would, you know the phrase, a century of humiliation. Now, again, sorry, pardon me for quoting myself from the book, but
it's all privilege, my friend.
If somebody were to talk of centuries of humiliation, it should be us. I mean, they had one, we had two. So, and if if you look at the destructive impact of Western dominance over our societies, I think India was much more impacted than China was, and I mean, not that there was much to choose there. So, where our government and the political party that I represent is concerned, and in a sense, I would say India. There's a larger Indian view out here. Look, we are nationalistic in the sense that, given our history, regaining of independence, rebuilding of society, getting a better place on the world stage. These are all nationalistic traits, nationalistic aspirations, and it's considered a very good thing. Now, but none of this is sort of directed with a sense of animus against the world. I mean, it's never been, the world, them, or even part of the world versus us. I mean, I point out, for example, that, look, I would think about it. What an extraordinary act it was for India to join the Commonwealth. 100 years of struggling against the British, and then we go and join the Commonwealth. I mean, you are an Australian. I mean, just think of the large-heartedness of that gesture. So the point is, I stress that a society like India, we have always been open. We've been open outwards. We've been open inwards, which is why we have multiple languages, multiple ethnicities, multiple religions, multiple everything. We have never been a society of uniformity, that there's virtue of uniformity and there must be some kind of, one truth. I mean, the fundamentals of India, going back to our faith and to our culture, has not been of a single sort of a single truth, or a single view, to put it more broadly. So I think what it positions us to do today is to be nationalistic, to build up our capabilities, to do more, to motivate our people, to aim for a larger role, to contribute more. But all the while you keep saying, I'm more nationalistic, but I want to do more with the world. Now that's very different from what you are seeing with the United States right now, or to some extent what you are seeing typically in the Western world. If you say a regime is nationalistic or a political party is nationalistic, it tends to be against the world. It tends to say, we've done too much for the world, we need to pull back. So, I mean, therefore my point about nationalisms. And I would say ours is in many ways a pretty unique nationalism. It's not a defensive nationalism. It is not a hostile nationalism. It's a confident nationalism. It's a globalized nationalism, if you didn't see that as an oxymoron.
Well, it's a very nice oxymoron, and we should adopt it as a linguistic outcome from this particular seminar, my friend. But I often think our European friends and the United States have a singular inability to ask themselves the fundamental question, and what if this were us? That is, if you have been through either 1 century or 2 centuries of national humiliation, think of our friends in Indonesia, even longer in terms of the Dutch occupation. And in fact, all of the high civilizations of Asia, with the possible exception of the Kingdom of Siam at various times, occupied for 1 century, 2 centuries or more, going back to the arrival of the first Europeans 500 years ago. So there is often a failure to compute, and even in dealing with our Chinese friends, a failure to compute about how a high civilization like that dealt culturally and psychologically with its own dismemberment on the part of a bunch of Western barbarians over a course of 100 years. But as you just said, Jai, you got a double dose. A couple of 100 years of the British, I wouldn't wish that on anybody. Pandit Nehru, by the way, must have had an extraordinary sense of humour also in joining the Commonwealth. I think he would have enjoyed very much the idea of attending early Commonwealth meetings with Churchill around the table as well. In terms of nationalism and national responsibilities, tell me, Jai, how the whole question of COVID is now impacting India. We see the numbers, we see the economic impact, 4.5% contraction in the economy in this financial year, perhaps double that in the upcoming financial year, according to data that I have seen. Tell me, how's it looking from the perspective of the Indian cabinet looking out?
Well, I think let me start with the COVID, and I happen to be a member of a group of ministers who were tasked with the responsibility of, coming up with the response, with the policy recommendations and the policy responses to that particular challenge. We today, I would say, if you look at it, we went to a high. We are hoping that it's plateaued, and it's now coming down in the sense after a daily rate increase, case increase of 90,000 plus minus. We are now at about 70, but again, I keep my fingers crossed because this keeps changing. There are so many moving parts, so many variables that I hesitate to predict anything with a great deal of certainty. But what has happened when it came initially? We did all the right things. Look, we stopped international travel much before most countries did. We had our lockdown much before many countries did. But the fact was, when the pandemic hit India, there was not a single producer of PPEs. There were 2 producers of masks. Even those imported the valves for the masks. There were no producers of ventilators. So if you look at typically the kind of equipment which you would regard as critical to a COVID response, it just wasn't there. Now, what we have done in this period, even I'm surprised looking back at it, that today we have more than 100 major producers of PPE, that there are 25 plus companies producing ventilators. I think there are 10 big domestic manufacturers of N95. We were scrounging around the world in the first few weeks and months for equipment. And today we are exporting a lot of this to the world. And we've set up almost 15,000 COVID centers. by converting hospitals and other public buildings as dedicated facilities for COVID treatment. So, in the initial weeks and months, you had very apocalyptic scenarios. What would happen in India? Would we go under as a result of this? And people were worried. People were worried in India. There were people worried outside. I don't think all the worries were necessarily the articulation of professional pessimists. I think there were people who genuinely wondered, how we would gear up to this challenge. But my sense is, looking at this, and I'm very conscious of, the very large number of people, who died because of COVID, the people who've been sort of infected and come out of it, some of them obviously with more permanent health situations. I grant you all of that, but the fact is, when I look at where we could have been and where we are and what the responses of a lot of other societies were, I think to me some of the really interesting responses were the amazing social discipline we saw. You would have seen me when I walked into the room. I was wearing a mask. I now sort of, except for the periods when I'm actually literally opening my mouth to speak or to eat or drink, I'm wearing a mask all the time. And it's not me. It's a very widespread habit in India. I don't know what it's like in Australia. But when I look at Europe and I look at the US, to me, it's amazing how many unmasked people I see on the street. You wouldn't see that in India. I think people rose to the occasion. In many ways, the Prime Minister himself was a great motivator. He kind of sort of went out there and really got people to look at this, take this very, very seriously. We went through actually some very major motivational exercises where the entire sort of country came together, and I think it's actually helped fashion a public response. So we actually talk about it. Not in many countries, people look at it as a public health response, okay, or as a governance challenge. We've actually dealt with it in many ways like a people's movement, that you actually get people involved, motivate them. If you are ringtones on phones, for example, you call up somebody first, you get a corona message, which sort of tells you, please observe your health restrictions, etc. So whether it's the media, whether it's the, any kind of communication, it's been a huge to my mind, exercise of a kind I haven't seen in my life.
Well, Prime Minister Modi's government, as I've observed it, is good at social movements. I'm familiar with what's happened with Swachh Bharat and movements such as that, which have been promoted from the centre, but have then caught on. Jai, you're the Minister for External Affairs. How has COVID-19 affected popular attitudes in India towards China, and how has it complicated your own job as Foreign Minister? That's before we get on to what's unfolded on the border in recent times. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think very frankly, public attitudes are more affected by what's happening on the border. I think till then, again, maybe, as I said, we have a certain history and a mindset out here. So we took it as a challenge rather than get into a blame game on this. We didn't go down that path. So people saw it as, look, it's a pandemic. It's come, beyond a point. You can always. There are viewpoints about where did it come from, what happened. Do we look at all of that? I think that's for other people, and WHO, as you know, is having an independent panel look at some of the early responses, etc. But I don't think that was the public, sort of focus. The public focus was, we've got this big challenge, we've got to gear up for it. If you're not prepared, what do we do? How do we support each other? How do you observe? Look, to teach Indians social distancing is a miracle.
Well, our Scandinavian friends tell me it just comes naturally to the Swedes. So.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine. They probably got closer during this period.
That's right. Hey, you've touched on the border. When you were Foreign Secretary, I know that you were with Prime Minister Modi during his summit with Xi Jinping, from memory, in a city called Wuhan. in probably April of 2018. Have I got the year right?
Yeah, you got the year right, but I had retired, but then my successor was there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you may have been there, but your successor was there. Well, anyway, let's reflect for a moment on that meeting, which from memory went for a couple of days. There was no fixed agenda. This was Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping effectively getting to know each other and working out a modus vivendi for the future. Quite a remarkable meeting in its own right. And then we moved to June this year, which is effectively 2 years later. And we haven't seen violence like this on the Sino-Indian border for decades and decades and decades. So give us your insight in terms of how all this happened, given the various attempts to, as it were, calm and stabilize the relationship over the last couple of years.
Well, between the Wuhan summit of April 2018 and what happened this summer, there was actually a similar summit to Wuhan in India, in Chennai, which was end of last year. And again, the idea was that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi spend time, talk to each other directly about their concerns. And, you know better than me the importance of communicating at a leadership level without, all the bureaucratic filters and the phraseologies, and so that you actually get to know each other and talk to each other and communicate with each other better. Yeah. And the thrust of the conversation, I wasn't there at Wuhan, but I was there at Chennai, was really, a conversation between the leaders of two neighbors who are the two great civilizational states of this world, who as someone said, were the two states where agriculture began, who will move into the fourth industrial revolution. Okay, so there aren't too many people who could say, well, I began there and I will carry on till then. Now,
but you have cricket as well.
Sorry?
So you have cricket as well. That's puts you ahead of the Chinese.
All right, I'll accept that. So a lot of the discussion was about the future, about our prospects, about our issues between us, about our history, how in a sense, if you look back at the India-China relations, there's more in common than we would tend to believe. For example, if you look at even the period when we were occupied by the West, because one was occupied, it facilitated the occupation of the other. So there was a sort of if not a causal, at least there was a very, very strong connection even in the past. So this, I think a lot of the conversations hinged around, where are we going? How do we work out our own relationship? Now, in all of this, what happened this year, of course, was a very sharp departure. Now, it's not just a sharp departure from the conversations. It's a sharp departure over a course of relationship over 30 years. Because since, Rajiv Gandhi went in 1988 as Prime Minister, and he was the first Prime Minister to go after our 1962 war, it took us, at that time, the relationship was formal. It was very thin. We had restored ambassador-level relations only in 1976. So societal contact was virtually non-existent. Trade was negligible. And we have built this relationship in those 30 years. And a basis for building that relationship has been peace and tranquility along the line of actual control. And we actually have agreements, multiple agreements, starting from 1993, which basically which created the framework for that peace and tranquility, which limited, the military forces which came to the border areas, which then, as time went on, people added other elements to how to manage the border. which set out how border troops behave when they approach each other. From the conceptual level down to the behavioral level, there was an entire sort of framework out there. Now, what we saw this year was a departure from this entire series of agreements. And the massing of large amount of Chinese forces on the border was clearly contrary to all of this. And when you had, friction points, which was large number of troops at different points very close to each other, then something, tragic like what happened on 15th of June happened. And, to underline the enormity of that, it was the first military casualty we had after 1975. So really, it's a very big deal. Yeah. So what it has done is it has obviously had a very deep public impact, a very major political impact, and it has left the relationship profoundly disturbed.
So what did the Chinese actually do on the border, and why do you think they did it, given the background you've just described?
Well, look, I wish, Kevin, you've dealt with the Chinese. I haven't, frankly, got any reasonable explanation that I can tell myself from them on this matter. So, and there are, today very large number of troops with weapons concentrated on that segment of the border, and that is obviously a very critical security challenge that we face.
I often think Chinese national security policy is a little bit like the Queen Mary, a ship of state which, once it sets in a particular direction, is very difficult to change course quickly. My own assumption is that given high levels of internal political friction in China over the COVID crisis in January, February, March, led to a whole new set of dynamics in Chinese, shall we say, foreign policy and national security politics, wolf warrior diplomacy being one manifestation. And then we see almost a resolve on the part of the Chinese system to tell the world at large that none of you should assume that we are weak. In fact, we Chinese are strong, and COVID hasn't weakened us one bit. And so then you see quite a change in the caliber and tempo of Chinese operations in the South China Sea, with the Taiwanese in the East China Sea, with you folks on the Indian border. And then, of course, just the other dynamics unfolding in the Sino-Canadian relationship, the Sino-Australian relationship, as well as with various of the Europeans. So like you, I'm in the dark. I haven't been able to get to Beijing to have conversations about what actually all that was about with India. But it seems to be part of almost a simultaneous wider pattern of, shall we say, Chinese policy assertiveness. It seems to make a central political point that COVID hasn't weakened us and no one should assume that we've been weakened. And that once that gets out to command level, it sort of then gets overinterpreted and then pushed even harder. That's my operating thesis, but I have no evidence to back it up with. So,
well, I am, if not agnostic, at least silent on this issue. But what I would say is, look, maybe what you say is true, maybe it's not true. Let's leave that aside. My point is, as a country which has built a relationship painstakingly, as two neighboring countries who have built a relationship painstakingly, and we have issues of difference. I'm not suggesting to you that everything was wonderful. There were political issues of difference. There are issues on their relationship with Pakistan. There were major trade issues, the market access issues. They are unsympathetic to us, if not, negative on a lot of international issues like, nuclear supplies group, etc. So there are a whole set of issues we've been engaging and talking to them over many years, including at the summit meetings. So the summit meetings were very open discussions on each other's interests and aspirations. So the point which we are grappling with is, if you have a very major neighbor with whom you have issues, you've been talking all along, these are under discussions, why this change, and then to deal with the emerging situation that arises thereafter.
Let me ask one final question, then I'll take some questions from our audience who are sending in a large number of questions. So popular are you and your book, Minister. Of course, the China dynamic is also having an impact in terms of the evolution of what's generally called the Quad. Back in 2007, the time for the Quad seemed not to have arrived. I think from memory, Prime Minister Abe launched it in his first term in office about the middle of 2007. And then there was a series of statements by Prime Minister Singh, and then Prime Minister Fukuda, who replaced Prime Minister Abe, and ministers of the then Howard government in Australia, basically saying the time is not yet, and quietly distancing. And so the Quad, including statements from myself after I was elected, went into, let's call it, abeyance. And now it is back, and it seems that India is more fully engaged. Could you, for our audience, Minister, just give us your views on how you see the future of the Quad in relation to China and more broadly?
Well, I think the future of the Quad and any other arrangements, which countries may have of a similar nature, actually reflects the movement of the world to multipolarity. I mean, if you look at the state of the world, during the Cold War period, because you had two camps and those who were in between, like us, who chose neither, you dealt with global challenges and global issues, those who were part of alliance structures through the alliance mechanisms, and those who were outside alliance structures through established multilateral organizations. I mean, these were days when perhaps the UN was more effective than it is today. Then when you actually moved to the post-Soviet era and the so-called unipolar world, at that stage, a lot of people looked to the United States and the supporting system of the United States, including at that time countries like Russia and China, for leadership or at least for responses and activities to deal with various issues in the world. Now, what has happened now, I would say, especially starting 2008 global financial crisis, and in a sense now, I think this year, 2020, the COVID world has aggravated many of those characteristics. You've had fairly significant economic rebalancing, which became political rebalancing, which has become to a large extent military, strategic rebalancing, perhaps even cultural rebalancing. So many more players, but if you look at the big shared issues or shared challenges, no single structure, no single organization, no pre-existing set of players who can actually come and deal with it. So what it does then is multipolarity will lead to this very ugly word of our business, plurilateralism, which is countries who find, I think I've heard an Australian call it minilateralism, which is a smaller set of countries who say, well, this interests me, we're all on the same page, at least on these sets of issues, so why don't we sit down and do something about that? I think it's a very natural evolution, outcome of a more multipolar world. So I don't think, in a sense, the Quad to me is is the horizon. Maybe it was a little over the horizon when you were Prime Minister, which is why it didn't happen. But it is now very much the sort of the landscape that lies ahead.
One of our questions, Minister, comes from Razi Hashmi, and it's about India, domestic, as it were, human rights and democracy, the Muslim minority, Kashmir. The question is along these lines. Prime Minister Modi, in his acceptance speech after the election last year, said there would be no discrimination against anyone on the basis of religion, and would move forward with, and he would move forward with everyone's trust. The question is here: have there been any specific initiatives along those lines in the past year, particularly given the controversy surrounding the Citizenship Act amendments? Your thoughts on that, Minister?
Well, you know, I actually think that some of the important developments of the last year were the delivery on exactly what he promised, which was no discrimination and better governance. I mean, if you take the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, for example, what had happened was that the sort of the freezing of what was clearly a temporary provision of the Constitution had created, all sorts of governance challenges, including discrimination in Jammu and Kashmir itself. A lot of socially progressive, the rest of the country had actually moved on in 70 years. You had, if you look at any country in the world, and if you, there are very few countries, there may be some, but there'll be very few countries who have not moved in a progressive direction on socio-economic issues, okay? But, so if national legislation is not being applied on a whole lot of socio-economic issues in one particular province, now that's actually discriminatory against the people of that province. And what it has done in many ways is it has actually kept them away from the national mainstream. As regards the citizenship amendment issue. Look, we had a partition of India, okay? Like it or not, the argument for the criteria for that partition was religious, okay?
Yeah.
Religion was not introduced now or last year. Religion was introduced when the partition of India happened. Now, when the partition of India happened, given the large numbers of people involved on either side, obviously there were minorities, significant minorities left on, in India and in Pakistan. Now, there was an agreement that, we will look after minorities and you will look after the minorities. It was something called the Nehru-Liaquat Pact. Liaquat was the Pakistani Prime Minister. Now, the fact was we kept our part of the deal. We have looked after our minorities. They didn't keep their part of the deal. And if you look at the statistics of Pakistan, the minority, the census, the minority numbers, it tells you a very, very sorry tale. Now, you've had people who've come from our neighboring countries to India as refugees. Now, what do you do with them? Do you let them remain stateless? Isn't that discrimination? So, if you have to address the problems of those who have fled, their earlier domicile and come to India, and you now, today, as part of good governance, you want to give them all the rights which other people around them have, it makes sense to give them a faster track to citizenship. Now, since the reason they came was a perception that, they were being discriminated against for religious reasons. Obviously, you're going to have people of a certain set of religions fleeing a particular society. So it's going to be their minority. If their majority came over, it is very likely that these are not people who face persecution there, but they are, different kinds of migrants. So I would actually argue that if anything, the record shows that, we have tried to address legacy issues of discrimination through these missions.
In terms of the dynamics we discussed just before in the Sino-Indian relationship and the problems on the border, has that impacted the situation in Kashmir? How are developments in Kashmir since the change in its administrative status last year? And more broadly, how's your relationship now proceeding with Pakistan? Any developments? What's the prognosis?
Well, in terms of what the developments were in Jammu and Kashmir, basically the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir has now become two union territories. Okay, but the external boundaries of India have not changed. The external boundaries of India remain what they are today as opposed to what they were 5 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago. So as far as our neighbors are concerned, our point to them is that, look, this is something which is internal to us. I mean, every country, after all, reserves the right to change its administrative jurisdictions. Surely a country like China has also changed the borders of its provinces, and I'm sure a lot of other countries do that. I mean, neighbors get impacted only if your external boundaries change.
Yep.
Now, and that has not happened in this case. In terms of your other question, how are we with Pakistan? Well, I'm afraid we are still if not the perennial issues, at least the long-lasting ones, which is terrorism from Pakistan continues. Terrorism from Pakistan remains publicly acknowledged by their government as a policy that they are justifying. So it makes it very hard to conduct normal relations with them. But it's not only terrorism. It's a country which doesn't do normal trade with India. It didn't give us MFN status. We don't have a normal, visa relationship. They are very restrictive on that score. They have blocked connectivity between India and Afghanistan, and from Afghanistan to India. So if you have a neighbor who doesn't do what do normal neighbors do? Okay, and I know Australia is an island. Okay, so you may have a slightly different experience here, but generally normal neighbors.
We handle the Tasmanian as well. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, they do visas, they do trade, they give you connectivity, and most important, they don't practice terrorism. And I think until we address that problem, this challenge of how do you have a normal relationship with this very unique neighbor is a very troubling issue for our foreign policy.
Now, all of us are focused on the US presidential elections. Leaving aside who might win, as we all read our opinion polls and try to make sense every 4 years of the American electoral system, which makes the Indian voting system almost look simple by comparison. Given India's current strategic circumstances and likely strategic circumstances with Pakistan, with China, your relationship with Russia, what's happening in the Indian Ocean, and where you wish to go as an economy, what would be, from your point of view, an optimal India-US relationship? An optimal India-US relationship? What would it look like?
I don't have a ready answer for that, for this reason. The relationship has grown so much in the last 20 years that trying to define what is optimal is like saying, okay, I think we've kind of reached saturation stage, or, we're going to be broadly in this zone. I'm not sure we will. I think it could be something, something bigger, something deeper, something closer. So I would sort of wait a few years before I gave you the answer to that, because I'll tell you why. Look, I find it a very interesting relationship because much more than any other relationship that we have, it's actually been led by the street. When I say it's been led by the street, what happened was, I read a book which gave some very interesting numbers. The numbers were this. When Nehru went to America for the first time, 1949, there were 3,000 Indian Americans. Okay. When Indira Gandhi went there for the first time as Prime Minister, there were 30,000 Indian Americans. When Rajiv Gandhi went there for the first time in 1985, there were 300,000 Indian Americans. Today we have almost 4 million Indian Americans, and these are citizens, apart from the non-citizens who live out there. So, and if you look at what drove this, it wasn't government policy. Generally we would sort of date, I would say the late, say 1999, when Clinton came to India as a year of, as the beginning of the transformation. But you see this actually, the movement of people and the deep linkages in education. I mean, if you look again at education has been a very, very vital driver of this relationship. Okay. The number of people who went there as students settled down. Then the dot-com revolution made an enormous difference because it opened up H-1Bs. Many more people went out there. And, because they also have a family-based immigration system. So there was a multiplier factor out there. So to me, it's a very unique societal connect which has developed. And why I think I would be ambitious on this score is, when I look at the future of the world, I think we all talk in a very broad term of a knowledge economy, okay? But what it essentially means is we're going to have more ways of embedding technology into our daily activities and, products and services and utilities. And the kind of demands that would place on global talent will actually kind of put a premium on India. If you look really at the world and say, and in this line of business, English is still a very major plus. Okay. Where is it you're going to? Yeah, well, they have a lot to answer for, but yes. The point is that the technology connect, the talent flow, what comes, that to my mind is going to be a very big connect between our two countries. And I would say COVID would have actually, probably looking back, also added to it, because COVID has made us very much more digital. I mean, if I were to have one among the many big takeaways from the COVID is how much more digital we have become in India and probably everywhere else in the world. I mean, some of it is more work from home, but look at, I have on my phone a contact tracing app, which most of us use. So, if we travel, we've been in touch with somebody, we fill it up. So actually, we kind of know each other's status, COVID status as a result of this. You look at the delivery today of, the funds we have sent to people who lost their jobs, or people, who were sort of what we call the below poverty line people. The food movement which took place, the delivery of, essential food to people, which was done. A lot of this was done digitally. So we're going to end up as a very, very much stronger as a digital power. And I think that has a big implication for the Indo-US relationship.
Well, certainly when you go to Washington, as you know, my friend, the positive sentiment towards Delhi on both sides of the aisle in the United States is very strong. And yes, there'll be frictions here and there, and there'll be debates about human rights, and there'll be concerns raised about various elements of policy, economic policy, and trade policy. But as a baseload piece of political sentiment, when I travel to Washington and I contrast the view about India with the view currently towards China, these are two different universes. So there is much for you to build with. Our time is getting close. I was going to begin to close off on something you've just touched on, which is the country's economic orientation. Prime Minister Modi has called for bold reforms in terms of stimulating the Indian economy as you move into COVID or post-COVID recovery. But then on the other hand, he's been talking about a self-reliant India. And some of the international community are finding these messages partly contradictory. That is, are we seeing this as code language for a new Indian protectionism? So in terms of trade, but more broadly openness, if you would again look out for the next several years, Minister, how do you see Prime Minister Modi's India developing on economic and trade policy?
Well, I'm not normally a numbers person. I prefer the prose as a way of expression. But I want to throw two numbers at you. Okay. This is our trade deficit with the RCEP plus Hong Kong countries. Okay. It was 10 years ago, $43 billion. Last year, it was $110 billion. 43 to 110. Now, why am I throwing this particular combination and this number at you? To tell you that, look, we have spent the last year, and this started before COVID was on the scene. Okay, we looked last year we tried to assess the impact of our current trade agreements on our economy, and what we found was that. And we have only ourselves to blame, okay? So I'm not, again, sort of pointing fingers outwards. We had entered into trade arrangements which have had a very damaging impact on our manufacturing, especially small and medium-scale enterprises, to a large extent because we are being flooded with goods which don't come from a market economy. And some of them don't come from a particular market economy, some of them because again, it's part of the East Asia, Southeast Asia has sort of become a supply chain. So it has a cascading impact as well. Now, what it has done is that within India, it has actually had a very, very damaging sort of structural consequence on the economy and on society. So even the periods when we have had growth, you're not seeing that growth truly reflected in the kind of employment numbers which should have come had, the SME part of your economy done well. So today, what I think the thinking which Prime Minister has articulated as more self-reliant India is, there's a difference between protecting your businesses versus protectionism. Okay. So what you are doing is you are protecting your businesses against unfair competition. You are giving them the support which all other governments give them. You are creating a level playing field in your own country for your own businesses, which we, sorry to say, haven't done so well in the past. So the idea really is create an environment, again, partly through policy, changes, but also through motivation, through through exhortation, and try to build greater capabilities. And if there was a moment, a stark moment of realization of what we had done to ourselves, it was when we looked at the COVID requirements. When you found, okay, I'm dependent, no PPEs, no masks, no ventilators, APIs from outside. And then I asked myself, look, if I cannot ensure basic health security of a country, what have I gone and done to myself? And I need to change this.
Our time's just about up. How are you enjoying politics, my friend? You're a professional diplomat. You're now in the Indian Parliament, which I'm sure is always, unlike the Australian Parliament, civilised, polite and respectful.
Oh, absolutely.
So no sledging, unlike in our respective cricket matches. Tell me, how are you adjusting to political life and are you enjoying it?
Short answer, yes. I think the adjustment, I wouldn't know actually. I guess that's an answer which others would give you. But I think once before I'd expressed to you, I said, look, you sort of admire people in a very dispassionate way when they are in politics, but when you see it up close and see really sort of what it takes to be in active politics. I mean, and I've really learned, because when I see, the people I spend time with are so immersed in politics, I honestly think that it is sort of a line of commitment, because I don't think of it really as a profession. I think it's a line of commitment which really calls for an extraordinary amount out of you. And when I look at someone like you, I think I admire you even more after the last 1 year that I've spent in politics.
As my own book reflecting on the first part of my political career, I entitled "Not for the Faint-Hearted," and I think as you will be discovering, it's not for the faint-hearted. S. Jaishankar, author, politician, Indian Foreign Minister, long-standing professional diplomat, but more importantly, friend of mine and friend of the Asia Society. Thank you for being with us. As for your book, I intend to have the Asia Society buy 10 copies of your book, and to the first 10 people who email in to our society in New York, we'll be sending those out as complimentary gifts in honour of your new achievements as an author and contributor. Thank you so much for spending time today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All the best.
Thank you.